Good evening. This is Julian Perez. I am the Vice President of Risk Management and Compliance with dentalcorp. And I am here today with the honor and privilege of talking with Cy Elborne, the current Executive Advisor of Henry Schein Canada. Cy started his career in 1972 in the dental industry, working with his father, Frank Elborne, for several years before joining Team Schein in January 2005, when Henry Schein acquired Ash Temple. After graduating from the University of British Columbia in 1972 with a degree in economics, Cy began his career at Ash Temple as a sales manager. In that capacity, he worked from 1972 to 1980, and then moved into his role as Vancouver branch manager from 1980 to 1989, and later president of Ash Temple from 1990 to 2005. The same year, he moved to Toronto from Vancouver. Cy is also a former president of the Dental Industry Association of Canada. The respect, admiration, and love that Cy had for his father was the same respect, admiration, and love that Cy brought to his role as a leader for Henry Schein's Canadian team. During Cy's tenure as president of Henry Schein Canada, he built the best leadership team in the market, placing Henry Schein as the clear market leader in Canada. In his now former role as president of the Canadian operations, Cy was responsible for overseeing the Canadian business comprising of 12 branch locations, 3 distribution centers, 173 field sales consultants, 188 equipment service technicians, and a total of 862 Team Schein members. He's responsible for the general management, sales, market share, and operating income growth of Henry Schein Canada, and has a sales budget of $450 million. Cy, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Julian.
And you have a fascinating bio, and your career in dentistry has moved through a lot of eras and a lot of interesting roles. Your trajectory has been fairly successful. I thought maybe it would be helpful for those of our audience who don't know you personally, if you could talk a little bit more about your career, starting from Ash Temple all the way through, your current role at Schein.
Okay, well, that's great, Julian. Having asked that question, we could probably be here for quite some period of time. It kind of expands over 5 decades. So to try to be quick about it, I guess it really starts with a career that I basically started, if you will, dusting shelves and working in the basement and working my way up. I went to school at the University of British Columbia, having finished there. Through a set of circumstances, actually, it really wasn't my plan when finishing school. It was an opportunity to work with my father, as it was stated there. So we got doing that. He was a sales rep at the same time. So that's where I sort of got involved at that point in my career. And things went fairly well. I mean, the 70s were a pretty interesting time. And we'll talk about change as we work our way through it. And there were always things that were happening that we went through change through those earlier periods of my career. But change has always been a big component of everything that I've seen and everything that I've been through. I was fortunate enough to do fairly well as a salesperson, and we got into management and ran a branch in Vancouver. And the numbers were relatively small, but the values and the ethics that I think that you come through over that period of time don't really change. You just sort of start adding zeros to the numbers, but the basics don't really all change all that much. I really think that through the course of that, maybe one of the bigger parts of my success has predominantly been about really being focused on the success of others. You get to be in a leadership role, or basically a servant leadership role, is something that I would aspire to. Is essentially as if everybody else around you does well, and that would certainly include our customers as well as the people that work alongside me, then essentially I could win by default. And one might argue that that's how I got to where I am today, by default, but there's a few things that happened along the way. So a big change to move to Toronto from Vancouver, but that presented an opportunity. My family and I moved here, and through that period of time, it was a privately held company that was eventually acquired by Henry Schein, which I think was a great thing. I mean, you talk about, things that we might talk about today, about being well capitalized and have the opportunity to invest, to be able to deal with change in a very proficient manner, and to be able to have that capital to be able to invest in the resources and technology and the things that you need to do. And I think that that's been very beneficial. Yeah.
So you were with Ash Temple from 1972 to 2005?
Correct.
And so could you just describe a little bit Ash Temple? Was it a dental supplier, a manufacturer? What was its role in the dental industry?
It was predominantly a dental supply company. It goes back to histories. I mean, Ash Temple was a company that was actually started in about 1898. But up until 1990, it was predominantly a dental distribution company that most of the people that would be listening would be somewhat familiar with, basically providing supplies and equipment and technical services. It was a big portion of the business. We actually got into some manufacturing businesses. We bought a company that made chairs and lights and units, a company that provided disinfectant and infection control products, and a cabinet company. To make a long story short, those businesses didn't go all that well, and they weren't merged into Henry Schein at the time of purchase. So when we came to Henry Schein, I think that that's when things started to. The mandate actually was to become something more than just quote unquote a dental supply company. We talk about it all the time, but we want to expand our brand and our image for what we can do in the marketplace and through these trying times. And you and I were talking earlier about the pace of change and how much faster things are happening. But Schein wants to be much more so than, if you go to a cocktail party and you ask people there, and maybe there's a large group of dentists there, well, do you know Henry Schein? And they say, yeah, I know Henry Schein. Well, what do they do? Well, that's where I buy my stuff. And that's true enough unto itself, but at the same time, there's much more that we can do and support our customers. And I suppose that we're going through these trying times today is that there's a lot of people looking for that and what we can do to help them. We then got into software and development and those types of things to be able to work with dentists really from the desktop all the way through technology and the things that have changed very rapidly along the way.
So I'm glad we're talking a little bit more in depth about Henry Schein, because I think your experience there is going to be extremely relevant to the questions we're going to get into a little bit later. So thanks for sharing your background with all of us. Much appreciated. Can you talk a little bit more about Henry Schein, its role in the Canadian healthcare and dental industries, how the Canadian branch of Henry Schein fits into the larger picture of North America and global Henry Schein operations?
Sure. Well, Henry Schein is a global company. I think it operates in 52 countries around the world. It has expanded over the years into some manufacturing facilities. It was basically, if people wouldn't supply things to Henry Schein said, well, that's fine. We'll go and acquire them ourselves. One might look at implants in those cases. CAD/CAM dentistry, there was something that was tried, but we've moved on from that with associations with other major manufacturing companies today. But for the most part, it's a $10 billion company. Henry Schein in Canada is about $450 million of that $10 billion. You gave the statistics earlier. So it's a significant piece of the framework of Henry Schein. But at the same time, a distribution company by all means, but a lot more about becoming a technology company and providing solutions to customers. The big thing that's happened over the years is the merchandise business has really become somewhat highly commoditized. All the things that we buy, which is a big portion of our business, about 60% of what we do. And those listening, that's the strips and discs and burrs and the things that are used day in and day out by dentists, but that's become highly commoditized and obviously price sensitive. And I've talked about that at length, with the internet and all the different things that have come along that we've seen, that one has to make a difference now and be able to provide more things than just those commodities. They're basically available everywhere. And that will play into some of the things that we might want to talk about as you work your way through this. People are worried about pricing and so on and so forth as we work our way out of this and what's going to happen with short supply. As you maybe get to some of your questions, I may have some answers around that, or at least thoughts how that will work. But at the end of the day, the same economics will prevail through that period of time, that the pricing is highly transparent. Yes, we've seen some gouging in some places, but at the same time, I think that will work its way through the system, and fairness and equity the marketplace and economics will actually will bring fairness and equity to the marketplace, such that really nobody will be able to get away with anything in any way, shape, or form, other than providing good value to the marketplace at the end of the day.
I definitely want to get into the economics. I think it's going to be an interesting conversation to have all in and of itself. Before we do, I just wanted to complete the picture that we're drawing here of Henry Schein as a company, because it is so well known to people in the dental world, and yet I don't know how many people could accurately profile the company. So you said kind of like 60% of the business of Henry Schein is supplying
merchandise, if you will.
Right.
Yeah, go ahead.
So what is the other 40%, I mean, roughly speaking, made up of?
The other 30% is capital goods, and then the other 10% is software services and all the things of that nature.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you. So we've been talking, and you've been alluding to the pace of change, and
sure.
how we see evolution and change in society writ large happen at uneven paces. And I'm wondering if you think the COVID-19 pandemic that we're living through is going to catalyze another rapid change in the profession. To dust off the crystal ball a little bit.
Sure.
We're not going to hold you to these answers, but from your wealth of experience, what you think those changes might be, and also if there's any historical precedents for this that you can draw on, whether it's in 1980s the AIDS crisis,
sure.
The more recent IPAC issues that came up in Ontario, Ebola, SARS. So I'll just let you maybe chat a little bit about where you think we're headed and what historical sort of things you can draw on to make those guesses.
Well, I think the great question, Julian, but I think that the outset of that is, the common thing here is that we're all in this together. And I think about that, and it's a need to share an understanding of an extreme unknown. I mean, some of the other things that I might just talk about in a second that are maybe just a little bit different, but it's dealing with this unknown about, how long is it going to last? What's the economic impact? What's next? And everybody's talking about what a new normal is, and how we might define that. So all of that's happening when you talk about change and the pace of change. All of this is happening with a growing sense that things are actually very likely going to get worse before it gets better. And I don't have all the answers to those things, but I can share with you, certainly from our company's point of view and our people's point of view, we're certainly going to be highly committed to do the very best we can to help and support our customers and our own team members to get through this. Over 5 decades, and you allude to any number of things that I've seen. I've certainly seen, 21% interest rates in the early 80s. I've seen 3 or 4 recessions. We've seen things with infection control, the AIDS thing that went through. I saw things that happened with oil embargoes. I can remember oil embargoes when I was actually a very young salesperson. It was in the late 70s actually, and wondered, well, that's no problem. I could still run around and call on my customers by all means. If I have to ride a bike, that's what I'll do. But the interesting thing in all of those things, and actually what the pace of change and what's particularly different, in my humble opinion here, is that the dental profession and our industry, I would describe it as being somewhat recession resistant through the changes that we've seen in the past. Not recession proof, but somewhat recession resistant. The difference to this particular crisis that we're going through that I've never seen before, and I think that no one's ever seen before, is our business has actually come to a grinding halt. Historically, through recessions, the dental profession, a dentist in one part of the country or one part of town may be able to do fairly well based on tenure in the marketplace and strong patient load, and probably survive that fairly well. A company like ours or our esteemed competition may have strong market share in one market or another, but one might balance another, and people can get through those things. What's very, very different this time around is the fact that it's actually stopped, where revenues have essentially ceased. So when we talk about change, that's a change that we've never seen before, and that's where we get to trying to understand how we're going to get through this, and what it's going to look like when we come out on the other side. So, I mean, some of the questions that we may want to talk about is, what's it going to look like in the next 3 to 5 years, or in the short term or the midterm? Some of the questions that you've posed to me is to, how do I see the supply chain changing, evolving over this period of time? So we might get to all of those things, but for me, I'm highly optimistic that we'll get through this. If I have any pessimism whatsoever, I'm only marginally concerned that we think this is that this may last a little longer than we think. And there is going to be ways to work our way through those things as well. But that's the biggest change. And we talked earlier about the pace of change and how things are happening. The dramatic difference this time goes back to my earlier comment that we're all in this together. It's not where, if you will, the industry side can weather this storm a little bit better, or the profession can, given patient flow and patient traffic. We all have the exact same problem today, and how we work our way through that, I think, is going to be the challenge for all of us. While at the same time, I have a high level of confidence that we will. I only am challenged a little bit to understand, to try to forecast what that pace will be and what that timeline might be.
Okay. Well, first of all, I'm glad to hear you're optimistic. I'm also optimistic. I also share with you a shade of concern that perhaps we originally, and when I say we, just the dental community at large, perhaps underestimated the duration or extent of how COVID-19 would impact our profession. But you suggested perhaps that a useful exercise might be looking at the next, let's call it 1 to 3 years. So I imagine, at Henry Schein, you've been dealing with the urgent concerns of just getting a lay of the land and trying to figure out how to satisfy as many of your clients as you possibly can, and to also just understand where we are in the present moment and where we're headed. But if you've had an opportunity to start looking a little bit further into the future, how do you see the next 1 to 3 years affecting Henry Schein's business, as well as perhaps just dentistry, to the extent you can?
Okay, well, I guess the first thing, as far as Henry Schein's business, is really to get through the short term, if you will, to take care of our people and our suppliers and all of our partners in the business. When in fact, as I said, your business has come to something of a grinding halt. What we're actually, with some level of optimism, is what we're forecasting is that come the fourth quarter of this year, if you will, October, November, December, that we might expect or anticipate or hope for volumes to be back to maybe 75% of what they were the year prior. So whether that gives you any sense of comfort how that happens, it's what I'm seeing and what we're feeling. I think that from the dental profession's point of view, it's all about dental visits, the number of visits that happen, and how will those things come back. Forget for the moment whether that happens in 2 months or 3 months or 4 months, but those things are tied to the economy. I think as businesses recover, and again, I think there's no question that they will. I mean, if you look at, and we all watch the news and the support that the government and the monies that are being pounded back into in supports and subsidies on both sides of the border, and if you will, economically, globally, those types of things, business will rebound. It has to rebound. So I think that those things will happen, and as in Canada anyways, patient visits, as long as companies continue to employ their people and provide benefits, then those patients, those dental visits will reoccur and things will start to happen again. And I'm absolutely comfortable that that will happen. I've often said that as unemployment reaches, go through the economic times where unemployment gets to 7%, 8%, 9%, well, that's the bad news, I agree, but that still means that, some 90% of the people are employed and still going to the dentist. So, those may be periods where patient visits might decline a little bit, but not dramatically down to zero. So I think as the economy recovers, that those patient visits will come back, that the economy will rebound, that people will be reemployed again, and the business will get back to whatever that new normal may be. So I submit to you that in 3 to 5 years or 3 years, how much it's going to change and what it's exactly going to look like. I mean, we're all going to have to be, from our side of the business, is to provide relevance to our customers and to actually be able to provide some difference. We talk about, a big portion of our business is being commoditized. So we have to be able to, you go back to the term, we're added value, and we are an added value company, but at the same time, that's going to be all well and good, but our customers are going to say, well, that's great that you're added value. How do I measure that? What did you actually do for me? How did you actually help me? And those are the things where the pace of change is what we're going to have to do to actually continue to be successful. Yes.
I'd like to jump in there, if you'll forgive me the interruption, because we collected questions from the viewers, and
Sure.
Several viewers were kind enough to submit those questions beforehand. And one of them, I think, ties into what you were just saying about, working with your customers and trying to add value for your customers. I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit here, and just do your best, because this is not particularly fair. I don't think any president of a company or executive advisor wants to be asked this live in front of their customers. But the question is this: COVID-19 has changed the economics for dentists everywhere, with practices closed for weeks, and as you said, revenue grinding to a halt. Will Henry Schein be able to assist the financially recovering dentist? Perhaps Henry Schein can forgive interest charges incurred during the pandemic closure, for those dentists who have an outstanding balance with Henry Schein. So you can continue, talking about how you'll work with your clients, but that was a question. If there's any way you can address that directly or indirectly, I think it would be appreciated by the audience.
Sure. And actually, it's probably, maybe it's the best to take the toughest question first, because I'm quite sure it's the elephant in the room, and of the dentists listening, I'm sure that's their first question. I think it's best to be transparent and honest and whatnot, as optimistic as I am, but historically, when we go through tough times, as I alluded to earlier, our business may continue to go and to move along and be somewhat or relatively successful. If we look at our balance sheet, if we're going to talk about economics, the balance sheet of a company like ours is predominantly made up of assets and receivables. Our assets are predominantly our inventory. Well, our inventory is not going anywhere, and you've just asked me a question about receivables, and we have, highly limited revenue. So, and if I was to sit here and say to you, of course, we'll look to waive interest. I could be digging a bit of a hole for myself here, but quite frankly, if I was to say that, and you've probably got, several hundred dentists at least listening to this, then it becomes common knowledge that interest will be waived. And that's great. We won't see one dime probably for 3 or 4 months. So very difficult for me to say whether that level of support will come until our business actually starts to get back in, and we see some opportunity to generate some revenue that we can provide some level of help in that regard. What we are actually doing is we have a division of our company, Henry Schein Financial Services, that is providing financing for existing leases with our customers today. We're providing delayed payments and those types of things, and longer amortization periods. We're also offering, financing that's available to the dentist at relatively low interest rates for 6 and 12 months to cover current balances. So those things are actually in place, and our field sales consultants, our salespeople actually are informed of those tools and can actually help our customers to look to help them through that period of time. I would also submit some of the best things that you can do, some advice or guidance that any small business person might do is look to their bank or wherever they go to look for what kinds of lines of credit, what those interest rates are. We've never been in a lower interest rate environment than we've ever been. So the access to capital and funding for businesses, for dental practitioners and laboratories for that matter, I think that the access to those funds, I mean, credit risks for dental practices have been relatively low, something that I can share with you over the years. I mean, our default payments and bankruptcies among dentists have been extremely low to what banks look at usually and the things that they go through. So access to capital, I think, will be available in the marketplace to help dentists through this. We're going to do everything we can to help provide financing as well. And I think those things, I think that the dentists should be looking to their, and I'm sure they're doing these things, to their bankers, to their credit cards where they owe money, to look for relief, talking to their landlords. Depending on where the landlords are, some people may defer payments or provide you with half the opportunity to pay half the rent. But it's all about communication and looking to everybody around you to support you through those things. So yes, Henry Schein will find ways to support our customers, to provide financing through these things. But I would only share with you that our problems, which is different, as I said to earlier, this time around, we're in exactly the same position that you are. So it's very, very challenging.
I want to thank you for that. And while you're answering that question, I thought that a whole nother session potentially could be you providing just financial advice to dentists and people in the dental profession who are going through these troubling and difficult times. However, we'll leave that perhaps for another session, but I do think there may be some value there. So if you would entertain us, perhaps we can have a reprise of this. I did want to stick to some of the questions that we received from our audience, and overwhelmingly they were about things like personal protective equipment.
Sure.
And the future of infection prevention and control in dental offices. So while we're sticking with your looking into the future and trying to make out a somewhat plausible reality, there's a question from one of our attendees, and this is it. It says, what does Henry Schein think infection prevention and control and personal protective equipment will look like in dentistry going forward? And I assume by going forward, what they mean is once the states of emergency have been lifted and once dentists are providing more than just care in absolute emergencies, do you think the nature of those consumables will change? And what is Henry Schein thinking about in that context?
Okay, that's an interesting question. It's not so, and my first thought to that is that the big portion of this is gloves and masks. And gloves and masks have been part of dental protocol. Well, you go back to the earlier one about the AIDS virus and what happened with the pinprick or whatever the case was be with someone in Florida in the early 90s, when those protocols changed dramatically. So I don't really see that as being any particular change as we go back, whether one has to wear an N95 mask or a level 3 mask or whatever those things are, and how does that change when a vaccine is eventually developed, be it a year or a year and a half or whatever the case may be. So I don't see that as being something that one needs to be overly concerned about. Because it's part of the protocol, it's part of the expense base, it's something that they've been doing for literally the better part of the last 20 years. Face masks is something that's completely new because it's the way that this particular disease is spread in droplets, and when you're working in the mouth and you've got aerosols and water spray, those types of things. Again, that, in my humble opinion, would be probably fairly short-lived, and access to face masks is not going to be overly problematic, and we can, whether I get to that question or whether it weaves in with some of the other things that you were asking, certainly those things are being produced now when we went to alternatives. I mean, Bauer, the skate company, that make the hockey masks, are producing them. The engineering, the Faculty of Engineering at Dalhousie University came out and were 3D printing face shields. They were using, off-the-shelf products, the elastics, the headgear, and whatnot. They would be able to print thousands of those things relatively inexpensively. ADEC in Newburgh, Oregon, a manufacturer, also produced a number of those things for some local hospitals and whatnot. So it's relatively, as you can imagine, is relatively low technology. And from an expense perspective, as far as the dental practice go, there are protocols to actually use disinfectants to clean those things. So that doesn't necessarily have to be a disposable. So I don't think that face shields are that going to be that critical. The major issue there, of course, is will they be available day one, whether that's 2 months from now, 60 days, 50, whatever those numbers of days, to get back into the marketplace. That's a question I can't answer, except that I know that these devices are being 3D printed in Canada in different places. So I rather anticipate that that a lot of those things that are being used in the first line of defense in this disease will abate to some degree. So not a major concern there. Gowns. I mean, there's manufacturers that are making gowns. Again, very low tech. And as those low tech, I mean, Brooks Brothers in Canada is starting to make gowns and masks. One could argue they're stepping up to do the right things. Others could say, well, I might not be able to sell a suit in the next little while. Maybe I'll make something else. So whether that's opportunistic or what's really needed for the marketplace, quite frankly, it doesn't really matter, because I think it will help. So those supply chains will ease over the coming months for sure, in my opinion.
So I'm going to follow up on that, because quite frankly, it's this area where we received our overwhelming majority of inquiries and questions. So we'll continue talking about this for a little bit.
Sure.
One thing I wanted to ask you, and I don't know if you can answer this, but I was reading an article recently from the CBC saying that Ontario hospitals were using 10 times as much PPE, and that's probably masks and antibacterial hand rub and gowns,
Yeah.
than the baseline of before COVID-19. I don't know that you can answer this, but would you be able to give a number or project a number for what dentistry is using in comparison on a per patient basis?
Well, I think every dentist knows that, and I think it goes back to my earlier comment that whether they'd be using 10 times as much, I think the dentists historically, literally, as I say, over the last 2 decades, have gloved and masked every patient, every procedure. So I don't think that's anything new. I can't see, and believe me, I'm no clinician by a long shot, but I can't see that makes any difference whatsoever in this new environment, that makes any change whatsoever. The other thing that I didn't mention is with N95 masks, whether you'd seen it recently, that the Canadian company Medicom, was a company that we do a great deal of business with, has signed a contract with the Canadian government that will be able to produce 30 to 50 million N95 masks. They'll start production, and that's Canadian production, a company in Quebec that will start actually producing those masks, and the startup costs are funded by the Canadian government in July. So I do see that these things will all alleviate themselves over a period of time.
So the N95s are all the rage right now. Everybody wants to know everything about the N95, and get them, and can I reuse them? And I'm not going to get into the reuse bit right now, because that might be a slightly different expertise. But you said, gowns are low tech, face shields are low tech. You called out a number of really exciting and inspiring initiatives of private companies stepping up, whether it's for profit or just to do the right thing throughout Canada. But the N95 seems like the rate limiting factor for a lot of people in providing dental care where aerosols are created.
Sure.
So I think everyone on the call was probably extremely relieved, if they didn't know already, to hear you say that we're going to have domestic production of N95s at the figures that you quoted within months. But with face shields and gowns, it seemed like overnight factories were producing this equipment. And with
Sure.
the N95, it's 3 months is still a long way off, like you said, for somebody who's struggling or wants to treat their patients or wants to bring their staff back. Why is it that much longer for the N95 compared to some of the other stuff we're talking about?
Well, you know what, again, pardon me, I don't know the science of manufacturing those things, but I might add a little bit something to that maybe people know or don't know, is that some 70 to 80% of masks are all made in China. So the supply chain is coming from there, and which is another thing that may help. But believe me, I'm no epidemiologist here, but let's look at this whole issue of curves. And as this starts to change in the clinical environment, or the first line of defense environment, the need for those masks will go down. Secondarily, the need for masks in China, and as we all know, they shut their borders down when they first discovered this disease in Wuhan. All the masks, believe it, as I said, 70, 80% of them made in China, they stopped shipping them to the other parts of the world. There was a question about the Donald Trump thing, about him stopping the 3M masks that were coming into Canada. That's true, the N95 mask that they make in the US, but they also have plants in China where they come from. So big kudos to 3M for their response to the White House on that, saying that they had humanitarian issues in other countries and people to support as well. So God bless them for that. Didn't stop them from not being able to ship those things, and some of them were actually headed for our warehouses, and probably some to our esteemed competition as well. But I think that the promising thing and the big thing in that is they do come from other parts of the world, and as demand for these things go down, and in fact, if you will, the biggest demand might be in China, and I can't speak to that numerically, other than the fact that that's where the predominance of the greatest numbers of these devices are made, and that the demand for them in that market is diminishing, hopefully quite rapidly. And that those things, and as we saw, the Canadian government had several aircraft sending plane loads of these PPE products to Canada. So they're starting to come in now. So I believe that we'll sort of see our way out of that. I can't predict the timeline, but I wouldn't predict, and again, I'm completely optimistic that that there'll be something available as we get back to work early. And then again, I'm not an epidemiologist. Does that mean, and I don't know, and that's where the dentists and clinicians and the governing bodies will have to tell us whether you cannot see somebody without an N95 mask. I don't know whether a level 3 mask will suffice, and those things will come back sooner. I can't comment on that part.
So I heard you mention obviously that the issue with Trump threatening an American company, 3M, under, I think he's invoked the War Powers Act now to control the flow of trade between countries. And, that was very disheartening for a lot of us here who are just waiting for all of our back orders of N95s to get honored. And so I'm sure your team is fielding questions about that on a regular basis. One rumor that I've heard, and perhaps you can disprove it or speak to it anecdotally, is that companies that supply medical goods such as Henry Schein have been having trouble at the border, where certain goods that have been ordered by Henry Schein have been diverted by the Canadian government to hospitals or retirement homes. Is anything like that happening, or is that just something that's going on in the minds of people in our profession?
That one you had given me a bit of warning about, and I checked with our regulatory people, and we've seen no incidents of that at all. We have not experienced that at all at this point.
So that's a good thing. Then there's one positive, and not to say that it can't happen. There have been a lot of surveys going around from provincial health departments asking dentists what supply they have, but so far that hasn't been an issue. So.
I think the point there, Julian, the important point there is that these things and Schein sources these products globally. As I can't speak to other companies, but Schein has reach globally. And again, I go back to these things that gloves and masks are predominantly made in China and Asia. And those products will be accessed, that we will not have to rely on just things that come from the U.S. Actually, much more of these products are made globally than they are actually in the U.S.
And that's certainly good news. And it also seems like if we've learned anything here, that we need to have a certain amount of domestic production as well to buffer against the impact of these unexpected global pandemics. Because I don't think many people other than perhaps Bill Gates.
Well, that came up in some of the research, and the things that I was thinking about that is, there are other things. I mean, is there a silver lining in any of this? And quite frankly, you talk about Bill Gates, who talked about this some years ago. You talk about, I mean, our CEO, Stanley Bergman, with the World Health Organization and other conferences that he attended. I mean, it's been on his menu, and I've heard him speak over the years that, we have to be prepared for pandemics, and these things will come. And if nothing else in all of this, I think that, and I think that, for the most part, in the world, quite frankly, was anybody really prepared for this? And I think that we've learned a lesson, and we will be much better prepared and take these things seriously. That I don't think people had crystal balls, and you read books where people said that the end of the world was coming and it predicted on this date. There has been a lot of talk over the current years that we need to be prepared for pandemics. We'd seen them before, as you said, whether it was SARS, Ebola, and whatnot. And I think that for the most part, the political communities, all of the different communities didn't take this seriously, and here we are found with being unprepared. The good news is that we'll ramp up for these things now, and try to be much more self-sufficient than we have been in the past, which could create jobs for Canadians, and make us in a better place. That next time this happens, I think that we will be much better prepared for whatever may come next.
Well, that's promising, and I'm glad to hear you alluding to silver linings, because I think there have been positive things to come out of obviously a very tragic situation that we're in, and one that's very stressful for a lot of people who are uncertain about their futures and their income and their livelihood. So I have a question it's a practical question, and again, I'm asking you to do a lot of hypothesizing here, so I apologize, but I think you're uniquely prepared to do this, and so I'm happy that you've agreed to be put on the spot. So right now, there are two things limiting dentists. One is a requirement that they only provide emergency care, and so that's a large portion of dentistry that is just not happening. It's not being contemplated anywhere at the moment. The second thing that's limiting dentists is access to PPE, in particular the N95, about which we've spoken already. At some point, the regulatory bodies will say, okay, dentists, you can now provide elective care or essential care or urgent care, and many dental offices will simultaneously rev operations back up, turn on their lights, get back to work. Do you think that there will be a second shortage of supplies or PPE when we see the, 10,000 dental offices in Canada all go back to work at the same time? Or do you think that your company and other companies are prepared for that sudden surge of activity?
Good question, and you have to look into the crystal ball. I think what I said earlier is that in all honesty and in full transparency, that there could be a bit of a lag there. But again, as everybody that makes these, that makes masks or any of the necessary things, the PPE products, I mean, they're working at tremendous pace, whether they be double shifts or looking to access or plants are being converted to actually produce these items that are greatly needed. So there will be a point that actually where the present demand will be met by the supply and the new things that are being introduced. So I would imagine that we'll start to see that even as the demand goes down, this curve flattens in the hospital environments, if you will, there'll be a buildup of all of these products around the world, as I say, because as things get fixed in one place or another, the curve comes down in this country or that country. China's the example, Korea. Then the supply chain will get some relief by not having to supply there, while at the same time, because of the crisis, they're producing as much as they possibly can. So will there be a lag at the beginning? You know, and I can't honestly say, but I would expect it will be challenging for a relatively short period of time, and I hope I'm wrong, because I know that Schein is sourcing globally to build stock, be able to get back to dentists. We're not so much in the hospital environment in the U.S. in our medical business in the U.S. It's basically private practitioner. It's not to say that things wouldn't have to be directed to where they're needed in the hospital environment, but I do know that we're building as fast as we can to be prepared. And of course, there's nothing of greater interest to us that the dentist gets back to work. Goes back to our earlier comments where there's no business for the dentist, there's no business for Henry Schein. So it's critically important to us that we can provide you with the goods that you need to be able to see patients when they come back available to come back in to the dental practice. So it's our strongest and biggest mandate to be able to alleviate those concerns and be ready at the time when that time comes. But I'm not exactly sure. I can't forecast it. Do I think that there'll be something of a lag? That's the tiniest bit of pessimism in me, and I hope I'm wrong. There could be a little bit, yeah.
Well, I have to say, I really appreciate your sporting attitude. Because I've asked you some very, very difficult questions, and I put you on the spot, and you know, I've forced you to do a lot of guesswork that affects your company, and I appreciate all of your willingness to look into the future and draw on the past to do that. I have a question about the present, or hopefully the very near future. It's a specific question, but I, as well as many people in this industry profession, recently read some press releases about rapid point-of-care tests that would enable people to test for COVID-19 in a hospital or in a medical clinic or potentially in a dental office. Yeah. And Henry Schein, I either is the exclusive distributor or actually the owner of this test. Could you speak a little bit about if that's coming to Canada and how that might help the profession or impact the profession?
Sure, Julian. In full transparency, we decided this afternoon that you wouldn't ask me that question, but here we are.
I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Well, because, you know what? Listen, audience.
Here we go.
I put him on the spot. I didn't. I probably didn't read that email.
It's so. Okay. It's okay because I actually
do it again.
So at least in all fairness, and it did come to me first, so I had a little bit of an opportunity to dive in and do a tiny bit of research. Yes, that Schein has two relationships around the world with, and I can't speak to it exactly, mainly because I don't know, but there's a company in Korea and the Becton Dickinson's company, I think in the United States, that Henry Schein will have exclusive distribution rights for point of contact COVID-19 testing. Those testings, those products were sent to Health Canada for approval about a week and a half ago. And we were told that it would be fast-tracked and then those tests would become available. I believe that there will be relatively large supplies to help meet demand. To your question, will they actually get to dentists? Well, obviously they'll go to, first point of care, to the critical point of care with the medical profession first. So I couldn't give you any idea at this point as to when they'll actually get to be available for distribution to dentists. Although they may well be able to, because my understanding is, and you have put me on the spot, that there are really significant supplies of these things. It's really in Health Canada now to actually approve it for sale to get it past that, and they're a little bit behind on their commitment to what they've made to our company. But those things, as my understanding, are coming.
So that's one of the benefits of doing this segment live that we couldn't just cut that out. So I apologize again.
No, it's fine. It's fine.
So we've mostly covered the questions that were submitted and most of the questions that I had. I wanted to ask you if I'm going to put you in the role of a dentist now. You own a dental practice. So what are you doing differently or thinking differently about getting through this crisis and then preparing to get back to practice? You're optimistic about the future of the economy, the future of the profession, but I have to think also that you've seen a lot, you've been through a lot, that you learn lessons. What lessons would you be learning now, and how would you potentially be thinking about changing your practice or preparing for a new reality when we return to work?
I think the first thing, and basically just as a business person, I mean, how well capitalized am I? How do I get through these next couple of months? It goes back to all of those things to openly communicate with your suppliers and vendors and partners and staff, for that matter, as well. So that's the first thing, and I'm sure that everybody's basically gone through that. The second thing for me would be is communication. Are patients actually going to go back to the dentist? And at what pace will they go back? Will they have fear? Will they have anxiety? So I'd be wanting to actually communicate, whether through its electronic media, whatever the case may be. And I would be building a platform to be able to communicate to the patients of what's happening. I think that another thing that goes through my mind in all of this that you hear about is the gateway, and this was maybe part of my silver lining thought as well. I mean, the gateway to oral health is a gateway to overall health and wellness, and I do think that it's important that that gets communicated in every dental practice. So whatever they're doing to reaching out to their patients, it's the old story when you've really got nothing to do. Or what somebody once said to me when I took a role as back in the day before we had a lot of technology, you sit there and you're answering calls, and somebody said to me, well, what do you do when the phone stops ringing? Well, I start dialing. So I think that that's something that I think dental practitioners can do, and if they can keep some of their staff, I mean, there's a great deal that they can do in reaching out to patients, asking them how they are, be empathetic and understanding of the trials that they're going through, creating a bond, if you will, to the dental practice. Call it marketing if you want, call it real concern, which it probably is. I think that's important, and I think that for the patients to understand that what the concerns are that they come back, and I think that patients will. It's this whole reset and how people look at things when as we do work our way out of this. And the dentist, and I think as many of us are, you're fighting for the disposable income dollars of what people are actually going to spend their money on. There's a great deal of that goes in, and we know about the 70% of dental coverage that's covered by dental plans and whatnot. But as people go back and think about these things, maybe they'll want to spend, it's maybe more important to get my teeth cleaned and bring myself up to date and take care of myself than it is to go pay, $300 for a new pair of jeans. I just think that those priorities might be set, and I think it'll be inherent in some of the things as we come back and what our values are and the things that are important to us. I would think also that some people may well go to, because of what we see with the pandemic, of how it is more impactful to people that are health compromised and elderly. I know, for example, my mom. I will make sure, and she has no dental plan now. I mean, that's one more patient that, in my opinion, that will go to see the dentist. And I think that these types of conversations and communication with patients would be the thing that I would be doing right now to reach out, keep point of contact, show concern, let the people know that you're prepared for when they come back, when they're ready to come back, booking those appointments. There's a lot of things that can be done, I think. But the big thing in all of that will be to instill confidence in the patients that they're coming back to a clinically safe environment. And that's going to be the big challenge. And if they can, if they can do that, I mean, I can only speak as a random sample of one to my own personal dentist who actually lives around the street. I talked to him the other day, And God bless him. And I just tell you a quick story about him. He went back to his office. It's a big dental office, a very successful guy. He's now got 2 daughters that are dentists and whatnot. He took all of his supplies, his N95 mask, all that he had, except for 1 box, and delivered them to the local hospital. So I mean, it's people like that, and I think that the things that are happening, but I mean, that's a great story. I mean, I'd stand up, I'd tell every one of his patients that, but how prepared is he, and how does he communicate that to his patients when the time comes that the people can get back? So those are the things that I think that I would be working hard on. It's just total transparency, communicate, let them know that their infection control protocols are completely up to speed, that everything is there, and that we're going to provide you the best service that we can. You know, maybe there's all kinds of other things that they can do. No different than what you're asking, that people would be asking me, maybe some payment programs or whatever the case may be. You know, as dentists need to get some revenue going, might be something they would think about. I don't like that idea, to be quite honest with you, now that I've spit it out, because I'm not sure that we should be providing finances for dental care. But there are other places that people can go for that. But again, I think it's about communication, highly about communication.
Well, I think that was extremely valuable. That wasn't one of the approved questions either. But I think we'll leave it there. That was really sage advice. I found incredibly useful and practical. I want to thank you one more time for your time this evening, sharing your wealth of experience with us, for being so willing to engage in a lot of the speculation I've asked you to engage in. And I think it's been really eye-opening and insightful for all of us who had the opportunity to spend this evening with you. Cy Elborne, thank you one more time, and I'm going to end our session there. Thank you so much, everybody who tuned in. I hope you found this evening's session engaging and informative. It's been a pleasure on behalf of dentalcorp. Thank you. This is Julian Perez, and that's it for this evening.
Thank you, Julian. It was fun. Much appreciated. Take care.
Thank you again.